Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs in the Paranormal. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. Today's episode is called UFOs in the Arctic. I've had a few of you request this. I've been wanting to research it for a long time, but it's an enormous research project. Well, I've finally finished, and wow, I found some amazing stuff about UFOs in the Arctic. Before I dive into it, let me tell you just a little bit about the Arctic. I've confined the cases in this episode to events that occurred within the Arctic Circle. This is a pretty big area though. The Arctic Circle is about 9,900 miles in circumference. It encompasses an area of approximately 7.7 million square miles. That's around 4% of the Earth's surface, so it's pretty big. The location of the Arctic Circle is approximately at 66.5 degrees north latitude, and there are only 8 countries, this surprised me, only 8 countries that are situated within the Arctic Circle. That includes Russia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Canada, the United States, specifically part of Alaska, Greenland, and a small part of Iceland. So really, not nearly as many as I thought. Still, it's amazing how many cases have taken place there. What's really interesting about the North Pole is, of course, with its location. The sun does not set there on the summer solstice or rise on the winter solstice. It stays there for just one day. It's a really interesting location. It gets the least amount of sunlight of any location on the Earth, except, of course, the South Pole. Let's not confuse this with Antarctica. I'm only focusing on the Arctic in this episode. There are, of course, all kinds of strange mysteries and conspiracies that abound about the Arctic. I'm not really going to go into all that. I really prefer to stick to cases that are very much factual and well documented. Of course, the Arctic is very well known for the aurora borealis, really beautiful. Compasses go crazy over the Arctic. That's another really interesting facet to all of this. Another weird mystery that I'm not really going to go into, but is certainly well known among scientists, are called polynyas. These are warm lakes that are not frozen, not perfectly understood, but apparently there are some reasons, whether it's currents or geothermic areas, that keep these lakes warm. Of course, there's the whole Admiral Byrd story, which I'm not going to go into. That would take an entire episode just to cover, but don't want you to think that I'm ignoring it, because yeah, we all know about Admiral Byrd and his trips to the Arctic. There's also an interesting aspect to all of this in terms of the little people that are present in all cultures on this planet, and that of course includes the Eskimos. I was looking into that because there's quite a few reports of that. That would take another whole episode, so I'm not really going to cover that either. But I will mention that these little people that the Eskimos do see have all kinds of amazing powers. Supposedly they can transform themselves, have superhuman strength. There's a few cases that link them to UFOs and ETs. But yeah, that's just another subject that's far too complicated for this episode, which is already going to be quite long, because I found about 25 really well verified cases. That's what I want to cover today. These reach back all the way to 1850 up to pretty much the present day, and not just sightings, but landings, humanoids, one possible UFO crash. It's quite controversial, but it's certainly pretty well known within the UFO community. So yeah, lots of cases. Let's explore UFOs in the Arctic. And the first case I want to talk about, I call Two Unknown Objects. This goes all the way back to 1850. This is an event that occurred in the Wellington Channel, and it's a really interesting and early case of UFOs in the Arctic. In 1845, the two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, which were manned by Sir John Franklin, were last seen heading into the Davis Strait, heading into the Arctic Circle. and they were never seen again. They promptly disappeared. Later, dozens of expeditions were sent to locate these ships, which were eventually found. One of these expeditions was the U.S. Grinnell, which was headed by Captain de Haven. This was in 1850. They set out in hopes of finding the lost crew. They were unsuccessful. However, on September 15, 1850, they did have what may be the first recorded UFO sighting in the Arctic. Among the crew was Elijah Kent Kane, and here is his first-hand testimony of this very early UFO sighting. As Elijah says, "This afternoon, a large spheroidal mass was seen floating in the air at an unknown distance to the north. It undulated for a while over the ice-lined horizon of Wellington Channel, and after a little while, another, smaller than the first, became visible a short distance below it. They receded with the wind from the southward and eastward, but did not disappear for some time." So these objects were not very large. They couldn't tell exactly, but looked like just a few feet. One of them was longer than it was wide. At any rate, Captain Edwin Jesse de Haven thought it might be a kite, but that explanation was disregarded, as who would be flying a kite in a remote area of the Arctic? Now, Elijah considered the possibility that it was a balloon sent aloft by the crew of the lost ships in order to signal the Grinnell. But no crew was found, so that doesn't seem likely. And as Elijah says, "The incident interested us much at the time, and I have not seen anything in the published journals of the English searchers that explains it." So that's a pretty interesting case. I don't think that was a balloon. Of course, really hard to say. That was quite some time ago. But this case also shows what a dangerous and treacherous place the Arctic is. As does this next case, which involves an icebound ship. I actually bought the book on this case recently. This one is quite brief, but it's certainly an interesting event. I call this case an eerie event. This occurred in 1912, and I think you'll find it pretty interesting. In 1912, the Russian ship St. Anna, which you can see here, became icebound north of the Franz Josef Islands in the Arctic. They remained stuck for a full 2 years until finally deciding to abandon the ship and take a 200-mile sled and kayak journey back to civilization. Now, one of the crew members was Valerian Albanov, who ended up writing a book about his adventure called In the Land of White Death. Of interest here is an apparent UFO sighting which took place on November 8, 1913. And as Valerian writes, "On November 8, an eerie event occurs, or seems to occur. At 5 o'clock at night, we saw some kind of red star that was moving to the northeast. At first we thought that someone was approaching. Everyone ran out on deck, but no one was there." No more information on that case, but certainly interesting. There you go, another very early UFO event, long before the modern age of UFOs. Whatever that, quote, red star was, it certainly doesn't sound like a natural astronomical phenomenon. Again, very hard to say. It's over 100 years ago, but certainly an interesting case. Now I want to move to another event, which is perhaps only peripherally related to UFOs. It's not completely verified either, but it's certainly a well-known Arctic mystery that I think deserves mention. I call this one Eskimo Village Disappears. This occurred in 1930 at Anjikuni Lake. This is in Nunavut, Canada, within the Arctic Circle. And yeah, this is an event which has gotten a lot of press attention over the years and has never been solved and could very well be UFO ET related. This controversial story has been disputed but never fully debunked. It comes from a trapper and hunter by the name of Joe LaBelle. You can see him here. He says that each year he would go into Inuit territory to trade and sell furs. He often worked with the small village of Inuits, about 25-30 residents, who lived at Anjikuni Lake. One day in 1930, he arrived at the lake to find this settlement completely abandoned. Now, the evidence showed that the evacuation must have happened quickly, because as he searched the structures, He found that provisions were still in the pantries, guns were still in the homes. Some tables were actually set for lunch, it looked like. Food was sitting in pots on the stoves. And as Joe says, the whole thing looked as if it had been left just that way by people who expected to come back, but they hadn't come back. I went outside and looked over the rest of the camp. I tell you, I was puzzled. I tried to figure out where these Eskimos had gone to. They hadn't moved to another territory, or they would have taken their equipment. I stayed around all afternoon trying to figure things out. There were no signs of any struggle. Everything looked peaceful. So we ended up calling the Northwest Mounted Police, and an investigation began. No footprints were found. Dogs that had been tied up had perished. Strangest of all was that in the Inuit cemetery, one of the graves had the body removed. Of course, surrounding villagers were questioned. Joe LaBelle questioned them personally, but none had any information. And that's really all the original article mentions on this case. Pretty much all the information apparently comes from this one article, but later accounts apparently expanded on this. I'm not sure if they're making it up or not, but apparently a huge storm had struck the area. According to some sources, a brilliant green light was seen coming down from the sky over the Inuit village. Some of the villagers thought it was the aurora borealis. Others said no, they had seen a solid object. Apparently the police allegedly had a report from a hunter who said that he had seen a solid object moving towards this area around the time of the disappearance of these Eskimos. So over the years, this story has been told and retold in various books, some of who did clearly exaggerate the account or wrote contradictory details. It all originates from this one article by Emmett Kelleher, which was published on November 29, 1930. Researchers have looked into this to try to verify it. There's no hard evidence proving this story, but again, neither has anyone been able to disprove it, and now, nearly 100 years later, it remains unsolved. Nobody knows exactly what happened to this small village of Eskimos. How weird is that? It would be amazing to know the truth, what happened to that little Eskimo village. Certainly does seem to be a mystery which has persisted all these years. So hopefully one day we'll get some answers about that, but I don't see that coming anytime soon. Now let's move to the next case. This is certainly one of my favorite in this compilation. Very well verified, so unusual. I call this one the Watching Globes. This occurred some point during World War II. The exact date is not known. Somewhere in March between 1939 and 1945. I'm guessing somewhere in the midpoint of that, 43, 44. I couldn't determine the exact date, but multiple witnesses, very well verified, so mysterious. I think you'll find this one really interesting. This very well verified and extremely intriguing case comes from naval historian William G. Schofield. He wrote about it in his book, Eastward the Convoys, which you can see here. It's recounted in chapter 15, which is titled Weird and Unknown. It's appropriate because this is weird and unknown. The crew of a Navy ship was in the Norwegian Sea heading to Iceland, and circumstances had actually forced them far north of their planned course into the Arctic Circle. This was a 4-ship convoy. It was just after midnight one March evening, again sometime during World War II, when 4 large balls of light appeared overhead. As the witness says, suddenly they were there, 4 identical balls of light, appearing abruptly overhead in about the same relative position as the 4 ships in formation below. They looked cold and white. They did not glisten or sparkle or gleam. They just hung there in the sky like pale, white, watching globes. I was on the bridge at the time, wearing the battle phones, and I heard several lookout gunners starting to call in at once. We watched them in wary silence. They stayed with us, hanging poised and cold against the blackness overhead. So it was impossible for the witnesses to say how high these glowing spheres were without actually knowing the size, but it was clear to them it wasn't ball lightning, which moves erratically, or St. Elmo's fire, which appears next to the mast of the ship, And furthermore, both of these phenomena are quite short-lived, and these balls of fire were just staying up there. So concerned, the captain of the lead Commodore's ship ordered a sudden 45-degree course change to the north, hoping to escape from these lights. But as the witness says, the strange lights stayed right along with us, maintaining speed and never wavering from their fixed locations. So the captains of the other ships queried as to the nature of the lights, and the lead ship responded, "We do not know. Hold formation. Regard as friendly." And as the witness says, if they were not friendly, at least they were not hostile. They made no move to descend or approach us. They simply stayed there, hanging in the night sky, ridging above us for a full hour as we sailed on our way through the dark Arctic waters, maintaining our silence and our speed and our uneasy watchfulness. All the time, our guns were held trained on the strange balls of light, and all the time, we hoped we would not have to shoot at them. Thankfully, they did not, as just before 2 a.m. the light balls departed, quote, all four moving at once, as though on signal, pulling away from their positions to higher and higher altitudes at a speed that was astonishing. And then poised high overhead, they streaked off towards the north and within moments had vanished from sight. Their departure left us all relieved but shaken. Who can ever say what force created and controlled the balls of cold light that appeared suddenly above our ships? We never did know what they were, where they came from, what they sought, or where they went. How does one explain a thing like that, except to point out that it happened at sea, and that the sea contains many mysteries, and always will? Very strange, undeniably something really unusual, clearly not some natural astronomical phenomena, St. Elmo's fire or ball lightning or anything like that. These objects were very clearly under intelligent control. So strange. And as we go along, we'll see a lot of cases like this. The Arctic is definitely being visited. For example, this next event, which actually includes a number of cases, is quite interesting, comes from researcher Wendell Stevens. I call this one Project Ptarmigan. This is really interesting. This occurred sometime in 1948. Wendell Stevens is a pioneering researcher, and he has something really interesting to say about UFOs in the Arctic. Researcher Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens has made untold contributions to the UFO field. He's written and published many books. He writes that his interest in UFOs began way back in 1948 as a young man when he was assigned to Alaska. It was his duty to brief and debrief the air crews of Project Ptarmigan, whose mission was to photograph every inch of the Arctic polar regions. And as Wendell Stevens says in his own words, the crews occasionally reported strange aircraft that could not be accounted for. If they were Russian, as some believed, then they certainly had experienced some technical breakthroughs that we were unaware of, and based on my previous experience with the Air Intelligence Center, I was convinced that there was no Earth technology capable of producing air vehicles that could fly at thousands of miles per hour and make sharp-angle turns at such high speeds, stop and even reverse instantly, stand still in the air, descend and ascend vertically at slow and high speeds, and land on the ice and water, and even submerge underwater and emerge again and fly away. These reports piqued my personal curiosity immensely, and I had to know more. So yeah, apparently these objects were in the Arctic way back in 1948 in fairly large numbers, or were certainly being observed regularly. When I hear reports like that, it becomes very clear that we are not hearing the full story about UFO activity in this area. While I did find a bunch of events that have occurred in the Arctic, I'm pretty sure this is just the tip of the iceberg, literally in this case. So many cases. I suspect you could easily times the 25 cases I'm presenting here by 100 or even 1,000. Because most people, again, don't report it, and it's clear that in a number of these cases there's secrecy and cover-ups being imposed upon what's happening here, because these are a lot of military witnesses who don't have the freedom to talk about their experiences, perhaps like a normal citizen would. But here is another interesting event. We're now moving into the modern age of UFOs, which began in 1947 with the Kenneth Arnold sighting over Mount Rainier, and of course the Roswell crash and this huge superwave that swept across the United States and the planet. This is when UFOs really started to enter our culture and people were really talking about them. And no surprise that they're appearing over the very high northern latitudes. I call this next case, it was observed by the entire population. This is a case which took place in the USSR, August 1950. I'm going to try and pronounce this village, so please forgive me if I garble this up, but it's called Nizhny Kolimsk. This is a really interesting case because it's well verified by a military pilot for Russia, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. The main witness in this case is Valentin I. Akuratov. He's the chief navigator of polar aviation of the Administration of Civil Aviation of the USSR. And he writes that in August of 1950, at 3:30 p.m., a disc-shaped object appeared over the small Arctic village of Nizhny Kolimsk. This was 3 days in a row, always at the same time. And as Valentin says, it was observed by the entire population, causing great interest, especially among us, the flight personnel. Now at that time, many weather balloons were being released by the United States, but as Valentin says, this disc was not at all similar to an aerial balloon in color or speed or movement. They reported the sightings to Moscow and were instructed to attempt to intercept them in their aircraft. They were able to reach about 7,000 meters, 25,000 feet, which was the limit of their Catalina aircraft, but they could not reach these objects, whatever they were. But as Valentin says, we noticed that the disk did not change in dimensions, and its movements were very slow from east to west. The color was pearl-colored with pulsating edges. So finally, they saw these objects gain altitude and disappear into the distance. And later, Valentin Akuratov would have a second dramatic encounter while flying over the Arctic Circle. That's a pretty interesting case, pretty early on in the history of UFO visitations on our planet, 1950. It's clear by that time our governments were perfectly aware that we are being visited by extraterrestrials. So any denials or claims that it's all attributable to hoaxes, hallucinations, misperceptions, and mental illness is absolutely disingenuous. They know, and they've known for a very long time. And here is another case which is extremely controversial because it involves an apparent UFO crash. This is the Spitsbergen Island UFO crash, which allegedly occurred in May of 1952 at Spitsbergen Island. This is off of Norway. It's a pretty remote location. This is, again, very controversial. There are some who have absolutely tried to debunk this. Not successfully, I don't think, because there's some pretty interesting verification to it. I think there are quite a few UFO crash cases and that we don't hear at all about the majority of them. But this is one that did get some publicity, and the publicity that surrounds it, I think, points to there's something true going on here. But you can make up your own mind about it. Pretty much all UFO crash retrieval reports are controversial, and this one, of course, is no exception. Allegedly, Norwegian Air Force personnel were conducting military exercises when distortions in their radar system at the base in Narvik showed strange readings. Investigations showed that the source appeared to be coming from the island of Spitsbergen. So they sent out a crew, and reportedly, pilot Olaf Larsen was flying over the area with his squadron when he was the first to notice a glint of light coming from the jagged peaks. And flying lower and lower, he observed the crumpled remains of what appeared to be a 135 to 150 foot wide metallic disc. So they circled it for about an hour, looking for signs of life, but didn't see any survivors. But they could see it was a craft of some kind, so a rescue mission was sent, and this is when they found this metallic blue disc. Now, per some of the reports on this case, there was a center transparent dome and what looked like 46 jets located around the circumference of this craft. And according to some reports, there were foreign, maybe Russian-looking symbols inside. It was believed at first to be Russian, but according to later reports, there were in fact 7 small humanoid bodies found on board, all badly burned. Each were just over 4 feet tall, very much human-looking, perfect sets of teeth. One source says that while a control room was found with buttons and gauges, there was no apparent engine at all inside the craft, which was quite puzzling to researchers. Also, there were no rivets, no fuses, no bolts. The craft was just all smooth, one piece. It was believed by researchers that the craft must use magnetic fields to navigate. Reportedly, they did find some pills and heavy water on board, along with a book-like object filled with strange symbols. Ultimately, authorities said it was not Russian, and in fact, the Norwegian government allegedly released a statement that the craft was, quote, definitely not of this earth. But shortly after that, a security lid was clamped down over the case, and little further information was forthcoming. However, Norwegian Air Force Colonel Gernad Darnell said, and I quote, the Spitsbergen crash was very rewarding. A misunderstanding developed some time ago when it was stated that the flying disc was probably of Soviet origin. It has, this we must state emphatically, not been built by any country on Earth. The materials are completely unknown to all experts, either not to be found on Earth or processed by physical or chemical processes unknown to us. Now, he said that the material was impervious at absolute zero and the highest temperature possible and to every known chemical treatment. He also said, and again I quote, we must tell the public what we know about the unknown flying objects. A misplaced secret may well one day lead to a panic. And he did say that a report on this case would be made public, though of course this never happened. Interestingly, journalist Dorothy Kilgallen reported on this case apparently, and shortly later died under mysterious circumstances. That's a whole other story. Still, confusion about this case reigns, with some calling it a hoax, some saying it's conflated with another possible UFO crash at Helgoland, and some saying it's the absolute truth. But with this statement from Lieutenant Colonel Gernad Darnell, there does appear to be some truth to it. But then again, researchers have not been able to confirm the identity of this colonel. Also interesting is that a Norwegian lieutenant by the name of Tillenson was apparently assigned to observe the polar area after this incident, and he released a statement that he has seen UFOs in this area many times. As he says, I have seen them land and take off 3 times. I noticed then that having landed, they execute a very speedy rotation around their axis. During flight and takeoff or landing, the brilliant light prevents any view of the events behind this wall of brilliance and on or inside the flying object itself. So that's the Spitsbergen Island UFO crash. I don't know. I think it's probably something did happen there. Oh, these UFO crash cases are so interesting, but they're also a little bit infuriating because we don't hear hardly anything about them, certainly not in the mainstream media. It's now getting coverage in Congress, which is super interesting. But where are the bodies? Where are the craft? Show us this evidence, because then we could put to rest any, mysteries or confusion about whether or not this is even a real phenomena. We still have skeptics out there, people who are scientifically trained, saying that no, UFOs don't exist. I really wonder about that, because anyone who does even a little bit of research into this subject can see that there's something really profound going on here. So those UFO crashes, that's another really kind of cutting edge area of UFO research that I think has great potential to change the way we all think about this subject. Now let's move on to another case. It's just year after year, UFOs over the Arctic. These are well verified cases, especially this one, which I call UFO tracked on theodolite. A theodolite is a telescope attached to a compass. It's a little device that helps observers to sort of triangulate and observe objects and determine exactly how high they are, how large they are, and their course across the sky. It's used for aircraft, it's used for weather, it's used for weather balloons and these sort of things, and occasionally for UFOs, as in this case, which occurred on June 26, 1952 at Padlopin Island. It's just a very brief case, but super interesting. Padloping is a small island on the eastern coast of Canada, uninhabited except for a small weather station. You can see it here. It was there on June 26, 1952, that 3 weather observers had launched a Pybal weather balloon and were tracking it with a theodolite, again a telescopic instrument. And this is when a UFO showed up. It was reportedly silver, difficult to determine the shape, which was described variously as peculiar, pear-shaped, oblong, and flat, but it was seen by the weather observers for a full 5 minutes. Now, apparently the 1950s was a very busy time for reports coming in from the Arctic Circle, because per the South Wales Echo newspaper, they learned that an American research institute, unnamed, says that in 1953, no less than 126 reports came from Alaska, 103 from Greenland, and 187 from elsewhere in the Arctic Circle. How about that? That's some 400 cases in 1953 alone, which allegedly occurred in the Arctic Circle. And what are we hearing? Maybe 1 or 2 of them? This is another really strong indication that we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg here, that so much more is going on that we never ever hear about and haven't heard about to this present day. So again, this should just be considered a tiny representative sample of what's going on with UFOs in the Arctic. But here's another case, which is really quite astonishing. I call this one, "You're Not Going to Believe It." That is a direct quote from the witness, who clearly had a very impressive encounter, which occurred on August 29, 1952 in Thule, Greenland. This is an airbase, American owned, and quite a few cases that have taken place there, and this is one of the first. This next sighting began when 3 Navy patrol planes were out on a mission of ice reconnaissance. They were plotting the locations of icebergs and pack ice for the Navy ships, but they had a secondary mission, which was to support a group of scientists who were conducting research into cosmic rays using skyhook balloons. They would send these up with equipment, and they would travel up to 100,000 feet elevation and take scientific measurements. It was on August 29, 1952, that Commander Edward P. Stafford, he was in charge of these 3 planes, that this incident occurred. And upon return of one of the planes, he noticed that one of the pilots, a Lieutenant John Callahan, looked, quote, tense and pale. So he asked him, "What the hell's the matter?" And Lieutenant John Callahan replied, "You're not going to believe it. I'm not even sure I do, and I saw it." So this pilot then proceeded to explain that they had been watching the skyhook balloons as they normally did when they noticed, quote, 3 bright silver discs, which were apparently investigating the scientific package hanging below the balloon. In fact, they were directly on top of it. The observers used binoculars and watched these 3 discs for several minutes, when suddenly they executed a tight left turn and took off at blinding speed upwards and disappearing in seconds. Now the pilots who observed this knew that nothing we had could accelerate at that speed at 90,000 feet of altitude, and they estimate that these objects moved in excess of 10,000 miles per hour. How amazing is that? I mean, with this object moving well in excess of 10,000 miles per hour, they estimated it could have been twice that. Clearly not one of our own. Clearly not a meteor. Again, really good evidence. These are trained observers, mind you. People who are very familiar with aircraft, very familiar with weather balloons and all the things that are in the sky. So not your average citizen just making a observation of something they don't understand. These are really good, well-verified cases. And here's another one, which occurred in the same area, Thule. This occurred, I call this one a strange object. This occurred in February of 1953, at Thule, Greenland. It was deep in the heart of the Arctic that Robert Ripley, a factory radar representative, was one of more than a dozen passengers on a WV-2 Super Constellation aircraft, you can see it here, which had, in February of 1953, just taken off from Thule, Greenland, deep in the Arctic, when a strange orange-colored object appeared over the icy wastelands. As Robert Ripley says, "I know there isn't any human habitation out there in those ice fields, but we all saw that strange light and followed it for some time before it disappeared." So this is a relatively mundane UFO sighting, if you can call the observation of an apparent extraterrestrial craft mundane. Pretty brief case, it's sparse on information, but again, undeniably something really unusual. Now let's move to the next case, which I call a third Thule sighting. This occurred on December 9, 1953, same area. This one is really well verified because there are 3 separate groups of witnesses, all military, all pilots, incredibly unusual. And what's interesting to me is how the military reacted in this case in terms of their explanation. This case is so amazing. On December 9, 1953, 3 flights with a total of 6 people observed UFOs at the same time. The first flight was piloted by Captain W. W. Irwin. Along with him was radar observer R. M. Roberts. They were flying an F-94 at 26,000 feet at about 220 knots when both saw what they described as an oblong blue light which zipped across the sky. It went very fast. It was visible for only 2 or 3 seconds. This is about 25 miles south of Thule. The pilots tried to turn and intercept the object, tried to catch it on radar, but were unsuccessful. It moved too quickly. But both officers believed that this was not a meteor and described it as, quote, an unidentified flying object. Now it was moments later, or at the same time, that Captain D.B. Zook and radar observer R.H. Ziegler were also flying an F-94. They were at 26,000 feet altitude, moving at 230 knots, and were 20 to 23 miles south of Thule, 2 miles south of the other flight above. And they described this object, which again they saw it too, as round or oblong, a white light much brighter than the brightest star. They said it was dead ahead of their aircraft. They tried to intercept it too, catch it on radar, but were unsuccessful. They estimate that this object was moving at around 1,000 knots. And upon being questioned at the base when they returned, they said that they did not believe this object to be a meteor. And meanwhile, a third F-94 was just 8 miles northwest of Thule, piloted by First Lieutenant James N. Hendon and radar observer Walter O. Rich. And they apparently saw this same UFO that was seen by the other 2 flights. They had it in view for no more than 7 seconds as it flew parallel to their plane, about 1.5 miles away, they estimate. They were moving at about 400 knots at 2,500 feet altitude, and both observers stated that they did not believe this object to be a meteor. Later they were interviewed, as were the other pilots, by Group Intelligence Officer Captain Harold R. Miller. After interviewing the witnesses, he wrote up a report and concluded, get this, that the officers had seen, quote, probably astronomical phenomenon. Can you believe that? Calling this a meteor when all the observers specifically told the investigating officer not a meteor? This just goes to show the lengths that our governments have gone to discount and cover up this subject. So much is going on at Thule. You'd be a fool to deny it. That's just a few sightings that are going on there. I've found quite a few others, but I'm not going to go over all of them because it does get repetitive. But it's clear that the Thule base has been visited over and over again. So that's an important location. Greenland is mostly in the Arctic Circle, so they've had a lot of activity there. Now let's move to the next case, which I call unidentified. This occurred on August 29, 1954 at Prince Christian. This is again in Greenland. This is a very brief case, but I think it's important to include because it's pretty well verified. The witnesses to this next case were the pilot of Dutch Airlines DC-4, Mr. H.G. Gardner, and First Officer J.V.D. Widdesey. They were flying over the Prince Christian area. This was at 11 a.m. daytime on August 29, 1954, when they saw a formation of large black oval-shaped or lens-shaped objects, which actually flew along with them on a parallel course for a full 10 minutes before suddenly veering to the north and disappearing. Air Force officers investigated the case, could not explain it, and concluded that the objects were, quote, unidentified. Amazing. I mean, when you're seeing a fleet of UFOs for a full 10 minutes, that's a long time. You're certainly able to have enough time to see that this is something unusual, not conventional. It's not a brief sighting, and again, made by a pilot who's very familiar with aircraft and astronomical phenomena. That's their job. So I think they know what they're seeing, or in some cases, don't know, because these are technically unidentified. Here's another one that did get a lot of attention. It's been printed up in a number of UFO journals and newspapers and such. I call this one Something Supernatural. Again, a quote from the witness. This occurred in 1956 at Cape Jessup in Greenland. A really interesting close-up observation of a UFO. Yeah, a long observation as well. The witness in this case is Valentin I. Akuratov, who had seen Arctic UFOs in 1950 in that small town, Nizhnekolimsk. He says that in 1956, he and Commander Nakhtinov were conducting strategic ice reconnaissance in their Tu-4 aircraft over Cape Jessup in Greenland, when, and I quote, we unexpectedly noticed that some sort of unknown aircraft whose shape resembled a large lens was moving parallel to our general course. And as Valentin says, it was pearl-colored with undulating, pulsating edges. Now, knowing that there were many American air bases in this area, they at first assumed it was an advanced military craft from the U.S. They soon entered cloud cover and couldn't see it, but after flying for 40 minutes, they came out of the clouds near Medvezi Island, and still there was that same object. Says Valentin, it was clear ahead, and we again noted this unknown aircraft along our left side. Deciding to examine the nature of this object in greater detail, we changed our course sharply and moved to close with it. The unknown aircraft also changed course and flew parallel with us with a speed equal to ours. After 15 to 18 minutes of flight, the unknown craft changed course suddenly. It flew ahead of us and departed upward rapidly, disappearing into the blue sky. The speed of its departure was so great that this phenomena appeared to be something supernatural. It's interesting how in this case the pilot called this object something supernatural. I think honestly that's a bit of a misnomer. There aren't, the laws of the universe don't get broken. When we label something as supernatural, what this indicates is not the laws of the universe being broken, but rather our lack of understanding and knowledge about what's going on here. ET technology is very, very advanced. I think that's one of the things pretty much all UFO researchers do agree upon. So it kind of disappoints me that this subject often gets put into that category of occult and supernatural. Really, it should be in the science category, because something clearly is going on here. And with so many cases, it's impossible to deny it. Really, at this point, skeptics have no leg to stand on. There are far too many cases that are extremely well verified. Here's another interesting case, which is quite brief, but I think important. I call this Extreme Altitude Arctic Object. This occurred in November 1958, well within the Arctic Circle, and yeah, a well-verified event. According to Ufos, the Center for UFO Studies, sometime in early November 1958, a U.S. radar station monitoring the skies of the Arctic Circle detected an object hovering at, quote, an extreme altitude. Now, per the station, which is not identified, this object suddenly descended vertically in altitude, remained briefly stationary, then moved at 500 knots for a distance of 100 miles, then climbed vertically, disappearing out of radar view. I always get a little bit angry when people say there's no evidence for UFOs, because there's a case right there. Radar confirmed. Something is flying around up there. There is evidence, and there's a lot of it. Again, these are not all just sightings, because this next case involves a landing. I call this one, a disk lands at Umiat. This is in the Arctic Circle. This occurred in 1958, 59, and it's a really interesting case involving multiple witnesses, this object coming down and landing on the ground. It was late in 1958 and early 1959 that brought a wave of reports of strange objects seen near and within the Arctic Circle. There were observers on the border of Finland and the Soviet Union who described these objects variously as luminous, brilliantly glowing, cigar-shaped, and spherical, some of which were seen to move vertically up and down. And later, in January of 1959, there were press reports that described these objects as huge spheres, disc-shaped, and rocket-shaped. And that's not all, because according to researcher Lee R. Munsick of NICAP, the National Investigative Committee of Aerial Phenomena, there were sightings from northern Alaska within the Arctic Circle by a small party about 200 miles east of Umiat. They reported their observation of a red, saucer-shaped object which descended to just a few feet above the ground, only about 2 miles away from them, then flew in a tight circle and moved off into the distance. And according to researcher Lee R. Munsick, he learned that officials in the Norwegian military were apparently aware of several sightings and were speculating that the Arctic region was being utilized as a base of operations for the UFOs. Very cool. I think that there are quite a few cases of landings we never hear about. And yeah, that case provides some really interesting sort of clues that the military of these countries that are in the Arctic Circle are perfectly aware of the activity that's going on there. Here's another really interesting case. I call this one Nothing on Earth. This occurred around 1960, 1961. This is an important case which is fairly well known within the UFO community, but apparently was badly misinterpreted or misreported, rather. The witness finally came forth and cleared things up and described exactly what happened, which is not how it was portrayed in a number of publications about his sighting. Around 1960 and 1961, Rubens J. Villela was working with the U.S. Navy's Operation Deep Freeze as a scientific observer aboard the USS Glacier, which you can see here, to explore this area. And while they were anchored at Martel Inlet inside Admiralty Bay at King George Island, on March 16, 1961, according to Rubens, and I quote, "We were witness to a strange luminous aerial phenomenon, resembling a meteorite, but which in my opinion should be classed as a true UFO. The object I saw was silent, its trajectory nearly horizontal." He later elaborated and said it was multicolored, blue, white, and red, and moved, quote, rather slowly, but left a sort of tracer in the sky. He said it seemed to be a solid object, tear-shaped. At one point it split into two and then disappeared very suddenly. The entire duration of the sighting was about 10 seconds, and he's later quoted as saying, "I believe it was much too slow for a meteor. Also, its appearance was out of this world. I can think of nothing on Earth which would reproduce this phenomenon." Now, Rubens was later disappointed to find that researcher Ivan T. Sanderson, who wrote a book called Invisible Residents, included Rubens' account and completely distorted it, claiming that the object Rubin saw actually broke through the ice cap and flew upwards. Nothing like that ever happened. I'm really glad the witness in that case came forward to correct the mistakes about how his sighting was misportrayed. Definitely makes me wonder about the journalistic coverage of this subject, which we know is not only being covered up and not talked about, but sometimes is just got all the details wrong. I saw a post on the internet where someone asked, have there been any sightings in the Arctic? And someone had the gall to say no, there are no well-verified sightings in the Arctic. I mean, come on. Again, anyone who can do just a little bit of research knows that there are sightings everywhere on this planet. And that, of course, includes within the Arctic Circle. Here's another case, which I call a pearl-colored disk. It's a brief case, but I think important. It occurred in February of 1967. This is in Tiksi, in Siberia, in the Soviet Union. So yeah, another really interesting case. It was one day in February of 1967 that Captain Petrov and his crew were flying at 25,000 feet above the town of Tiksi, Siberia. This is when they saw what they described as a pearl-colored disk. It was a craft which quickly overtook their own plane, gained altitude, and flew off. Now, per Valentin I. Akuratov, who had two of his own sightings, he says, quote, "This disk did not resemble any existing aircraft." And he says that pilots have often reported sightings in the Arctic Circle, but because the Russian press often discounts them as, quote, light effects, and fearing ridicule from others, the vast majority of pilots do not report their sightings. Admittedly, a very brief case, but really important because that one provides a very strong clue or indication that the vast majority of reports coming out of that area never reached the public's ears. Such a shame. This world would be a very different place if we all had truth and honesty and transparency with this subject. Just not there yet. It's one of the reasons why I do this research. We all deserve to know the truth about what's going on. Now here's a really interesting case which clearly affected the witness quite profoundly. I call this one disconcertingly captivating, deeply provocative, utterly incomprehensible. That's a direct quote from the witness, who you can tell, was very much impressed by his sighting, which occurred on August 22nd, 1967 in the Timor Peninsula. This is again in Siberia. This next report comes from Soviet journalist Alfred Tolchensky. It was 3 p.m. on August 22nd, 1967, as Alfred was flying with pilot Volodya Novikov in an Mi-8 convoy helicopter. They were flying at a few thousand feet over the remote Siberian tundra of the northern Timor Peninsula, with the closest town to them, the village of Chatanga. This was hundreds of miles away. And as Alfred says, "Suddenly I noticed a strange dot penetrating my field of vision and moving not in accordance with any established flight pattern, but rather in a perfectly straight line with incredible velocity. I could in no way accurately determine the distance separating us from this flying object, nor could I discern what type of craft it might possibly be. Now it was a clear blue sky at this time, and the object was casting a dazzling reflection from the sun, making it nearly impossible to determine its exact shape. In fact, Alfred was trying to determine if this object could be explained as a balloon, a satellite, or anything conventional, when it suddenly slowed down, started to move slower and slower, and then, as Alfred says, I could not believe what I was seeing. It had come to a complete halt, as though rooted to a single spot in the sky. And then, within a second's fraction, the object changed course by a full 90 degrees, and with astonishing speed, literally vanished into the air itself. So Alfred immediately grabbed the mic and said, "Did you see that? Did you see that or not?" And the pilot, Volodya, smiled and said, quote, "I saw what I saw, and then again I didn't see, because orders are, they are not to be seen. Understand?"
Well, as Alfred says, and I quote, "I was far too shocked to understand a thing." But he later realized that, quote, "what I had seen in that northern azure sky was unmistakably a UFO, an unidentified flying object, or in simpler words, a flying saucer." Now, Volodya later told Alfred that in his career he had seen many UFOs, several involving solid metallic craft. Later, Alfred had another identical sighting while flying in the Arctic, and later, in 1969, traveled to the tiny village of Mesivak. This is 300 miles from Norilsk, and while there, he saw on the ground a perfectly circular 35-foot wide depression, completely barren of growth. He was there with a group of other scientists, and as Alfred says, "the local inhabitants, the Nensi, speaking in their chirping bird-like language, pointed to the sky, leaving the geologists of the expedition dumbfounded." Now, in an article titled, "Do UFOs Exist? Now It Can Be Told," which was written by Alfred Tuchenski, he writes that, quote, "all this was so disconcertingly captivating, so deeply provocative, and so utterly, utterly incomprehensible."
How amazing is that? I mean, wow, it takes a lot of courage for some of these military witnesses to step forward and talk about UFOs, knowing that there could be serious repercussions to their reputation, to their career. So kudos to all these military witnesses who do find the courage to come forth and share what they've seen in the Arctic Circle. Now let's move to the next case, which I think this one has to be my favorite in this whole compilation here. It's so interesting, very detailed, so unusual. I call this "An Extraordinary Thing Happened to Me on My Way to the North Pole." This is a first-hand account from a journalist who was on a flight over the Arctic when she saw something very unusual. This was on March 1st, 1968, and it took place in northern Canada.
This amazing case comes directly from the first-hand witness, Sally Rinaley, who wrote about it in an article titled "Luminous Objects on Arctic Ice," which she wrote for Fate magazine. Her adventure began when she was invited to participate in NASA's Aurora expedition of February 29, 1965 to March 10, 1965, which was organized to measure and observe the polar regions, specifically the Aurora Borealis. Sally was invited in her capacity as a journalist and writes, quote, "I was the only reporter on the second leg of this well-planned expedition. It was the most exciting assignment of my journalistic career." So they flew across northern Canada, northern Alaska, northern Greenland, over the polar cap. These flights typically lasted about 6 hours. Most of the time they flew between 37,000 and 40,000 feet elevation. While they were flying, this weather gauge that they had, get this, showed the outside temperature to be about 60 degrees below zero. On March 1st, 1965, Sally and 33 other passengers were on board the Galileo. You can see it here. It's a 129-foot Convair 990 jet, which had been specially outfitted with cameras and observation windows and all kinds of scientific equipment and survival gear. And on the night in question, Sally got up to get a cup of coffee, then curled up back in her seat to continue watching the amazing view of the remote, empty, and desolate frozen ice cap below, and the crystal black sky above, and the aurora. But at some point she looked down to the ground and got an incredible shock. And I'll just quote her at length, because this is amazing. As Sally says in her own words, "Far below, on the icy surface, were 3 round glowing lights arranged in a straight line. Each light was huge. All were the same size and perfectly round. They were luminous, glowing with an inner white light completely different from any other thing we had seen in the Arctic. The lights were so different, in fact, that at first I just stared, fascinated, trying to memorize everything about them before they disappeared behind us. They were not at all like the lights of any settlement or village. They were not like lights on a boat, ship, or any familiar flying craft. They looked like flying saucers landed on the ice. And if that's what they were huge ones. Another unusual thing was that the lights were an equal distance apart. I was greatly impressed by their size. These luminous objects, whatever they were, must each have been as large as several city blocks, perhaps even larger. I could hardly believe my eyes. So she was absolutely entranced with amazement, but finally had the presence of mind to ask Joe March, the official expedition photographer, what are they? And his response was, I don't know. I really don't know. She then asked the scientist in the seat ahead of her, pointed out these objects, and his reply was, I just don't know. Some kind of reflections? And Sally balked at that explanation and told him, you know they're not. They're not following along. And he replied, they don't look like settlements. I don't know what they are. By this point, the lights were already disappearing behind them, but moments later, there were 3 more. As Sally says, they were round, glowing, white and luminous, about the same size as the others, but this time, instead of being in a row, they were arranged in a triangle. So there were 3 of them, and again, she could not describe these as being anything similar to lights from a village or any kind of aircraft that we know. But the plane moved along, and soon they passed over these lights too. And returning to the base, waking up the next morning, Sally decided to do some investigating. And she asked several of the members of the expedition if they had seen the strange lights. But nobody had. It was weird. The only 2 who would admit to seeing the lights were the scientist and the photographer that she had specifically questioned at the time the sighting was taking place. As you can see, she sketched them and was amazed to see that their placement formed a kind of arrow. As Sally says, what significance could this strange symbol formed by the lights on the ice have? How can we explain the unique formation of the mystery lights? These lights were miles and miles from any settlement or known life, and they were arranged in geometric patterns. We may never know the answer. We may never see the strange lights again. I do not know what they were. I only know that I saw them.
A truly amazing sighting. I don't know what those objects were doing way up there on the frozen north, hanging out, but they were clearly very, very large objects because they were seen from a pretty high altitude. And it's also weird that there were only a few witnesses. I suspect that there were quite a few other witnesses, but that this got covered up because let's face it, they were there to observe the aurora and anything unusual. This was a scientific expedition. I am quite confident that there's more information on this case that we will probably never hear about. But now let's move to the next case, because there's always another. I call this one Eskimos Observe UFO Landing. This is another really interesting landing case which occurred on August 16, 1972 near Stebbins, Alaska. Pretty well verified, multiple witnesses, landing traces. I, again, believe that there is more information on this case than I was able to find, certainly. So it's a pretty brief report, but I think an important one. It was at the small town of St. Michael, not far from Stebbins, Alaska, well above the Arctic Circle, that on August 16, 1972, Eskimo Scout Sergeant John Chimuk and his wife both saw what they described as a football-shaped object. They could actually see it had a window in the front, red lights on the front and the rear, and as they watched, it moved slowly across the sky and then, to their surprise, actually landed on the ground. And it remained there for a full 5 minutes, after which point it took off. Going to investigate, they saw a 3-foot wide, 2-inch deep hole in the ground. And they could see that the grass inside this hole was burned. Now, it turned out about 20 other people in the town saw a UFO the next day, but only the Chimuks, of course, had seen this object land. They reported it to the 1st Scout Battalion headquarters, who did confirm the presence of the landing traces, reportedly took photographs and samples of both the soil and vegetation. They said they would analyze it, but the results of this analysis were apparently never released. I would love to see the photos of these landing traces. Unfortunately, I was not able to find them, but they're out there somewhere. Man, oh man, there's so much evidence that we never get to see. It's really disappointing and so frustrating because this subject should not be covered up the way it is. People should not have to suffer ridicule and disbelief and skepticism, the fear and confusion surrounding this subject, the disinformation. It's mind-blowing how hard our governments have worked to cover this up. Don't think they've been successful? The truth is coming out. Because here's another case, which I call Arctic Ocean UFO. Another really amazing case from very credible witnesses. This occurred on October 16, 1976 in the Arctic Sea, in the Arctic Circle. And yeah, an amazing case involving a UFO.
This brief but interesting sighting comes from a crew member of the MT Farnella, which was piloted by skipper H. Powdrell and was published in the October 1977 issue of the Marine Observer. It was at 11 p.m. on October 16, 1976, as the main witness decided to visit the wheelhouse of the boat. Now also on board was radio officer Mr. G. Christmas. Now arriving at the wheelhouse, the skipper pointed out to the witness an unusual object flying across the sky and told him it had been in view for about 5 minutes. So using a pair of binoculars, the witness observed this object close up, and as he says, and I quote, "It could be described as a brilliant light traveling at a very high altitude, leaving a bright V-shaped trail of rays, like the sun's rays from behind a cloud." So as he and the others watched, this object descended and then suddenly reversed its course, changing in appearance to, quote, "totally circular." It came lower and closer, and they could now see that inside the circle of light was another circular object, much more intense and pulsating with white light. After about 2 minutes of observation, this inner circle of light vanished within the outer glow of this object, and the entire object just moved off and faded from sight.
How many cases is it going to take before people recognize that we are being visited, that we are not alone in this universe? And it's amazing to see all this activity up in an area which is really largely uninhabited. So the vast majority of cases are probably not even observed by human eyes. But here's one that was. I call this next case an eerie appearance. This occurred on October 22nd, 1980, again in the Arctic Ocean, and military witnesses pretty well verified.
This case comes from respected Soviet researcher Felix Zeigel, who reports on the experience of an aviator by the name of Captain Vladimir Dubstov. Now, per Felix Zeigel, on October 22, 1980, Captain Dubstov was flying over the Arctic Ocean when he saw a circular object hovering motionless over the ocean's surface. And it was huge. He said it appeared to be at least 900 feet in diameter. As Felix Zeigel says, it was truly immense. A cone of light protruding downward from it gave it an eerie appearance, but it showed no sign of life. Now Captain Dubstov, very much intrigued, decided to move closer, and as Felix Zeigel says, then all of his instruments went haywire. He began to lose altitude. At that point, almost immediately, the craft rose vertically at high speed, whooshing by Captain Dubstov's plane, leaving a sort of green-blue vapor behind. As you can imagine, Captain Dubstov was stunned. He had heard reports from other Arctic pilots, but this was his first encounter. And per Felix Zeigel, the polar region is the gate through which extraterrestrial ships enter and exit the Earth's gravitational field. Now, per researcher Robert Barry, a similar incident occurred in the same area 2 months earlier. As he writes, a jet pilot from the Moscow Air Defense Unit was flying over the Arctic Ocean when he encountered a huge craft similar to the one later seen by Dubstov. The craft engaged in a series of unbelievable maneuvers which could not be matched by the Soviet fighter plane.
There you go, more evidence that we're only seeing just the little bit of what is going on here. So frustrating. I suspect that if I were to spend more time doing research in this area, kind of charting every single city that's in the Arctic Circle, I could write an entire book on the cases that have occurred in the Arctic Circle. But I just want to really move to other projects because there's so much going on. But what I'm saying is that this is an open opportunity for research here. This field is crying for good research. There's so much going on that we never hear about. Here's another really interesting case, which I call Caught on Radar. This occurred on January 5, 1981, and is another case which took place at the Thule Air Base in Greenland and provides absolute confirmation that something unusual is going on at that base. For those who say, where's the evidence to prove UFOs, this case provides compelling radar confirmation. It is brief, but at 12:50 on January 5, 1981, witnesses described a flaming squarish disk which appeared only briefly before disappearing over the skies near Thule Air Force Base. Lots of UFOs there. But supporting the testimony of the eyewitnesses, radar stations at the base allegedly recorded a, quote, unidentified flying object, which was in the same area at the same exact time as this visual observation. A pretty brief report, but certainly important. Now, here's a super interesting case, which is kind of second-hand, so it's not super well verified, but given who the witness is, who is reporting on this, I think it's very important because it's none other than Dr. Bob Jacobs, who had a very well-known and very well authenticated sighting himself. But he's not the actual witness, it's a friend of his. This is an amazing case because it does involve a humanoid, and I call this one an Arctic humanoid. The exact date is not known in this one, but it's prior to 1982 or thereabouts. And again, I believe, from what I can understand from the report, occurred at Thule Air Force Base. But yeah, this one is a really interesting case because it echoes what we see in so many reports where people meet humanoids face to face who have a message for humanity. Again, this story is second-hand, and the exact date and location are unknown, but it is so extraordinary that I think it's worthy of inclusion, because again, the witness reporting this is Dr. Bob Jacobs, a professor from the University of Wisconsin, a former Air Force photographer who is very well known in the UFO community for having filmed an apparent UFO incident at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Now, he tells the story of his friend, who is anonymous, who was a security man at the Air Force guarding bomber planes at a U.S. base in Greenland, likely Thule. But per Bob Jacobs, his friend and another security guard, while on duty, spotted a figure of what appeared to be a woman with long blonde hair standing on a hill about 300 feet away. She wore a blue ski suit, her hair was long and flowing, but the weird thing was, nobody should have been on that hill in that area, which is secured and very close to this base. So, one of the security guards went up the hill to investigate, and as he got close, he was surprised to see that this figure was taller than a normal person, 7 feet tall, and it was not a woman, but a man. Now this strange man proceeded to put his arm around the guard and led him over the hill to the other side, out of sight of Bob Jacobs' friend who had remained behind. So he didn't see what was happening. But this guard returned to his post a few minutes later, and his eyes were all glassy, he looked dazed, and he explained to his other co-employee, the security guard, that this tall figure was in fact a male, an extraterrestrial, and had taken him onto a landed spacecraft. It was weird, he said, because he could hear music playing in his head as he approached this craft. This being was communicating with him that way, telepathically, and had a message for him. According to the witness, this ET said that we have to stop testing atomic bombs because we're damaging the atmosphere of our planet. So after telling this extraordinary story, both men, still outside,
looked up and saw this flying saucer lift up from behind that hill and disappear up into the sky and was gone.
There aren't a whole lot of reports involving humanoids in the Arctic, but that's definitely one of them. And given that this comes from Dr. Bob Jacobs, I think it's important we take it seriously. His friend was clearly very impressed by the sighting, and while his friend didn't see the humanoid directly, the other friend did. And the message, again, is something we hear so often. ETs are very, very concerned about our use of nuclear weapons. I hope we listen, because it's clear that this is a pathway towards self-destruction, and that's the last thing any of us need. All right, let's move to the next case. We're moving forward in time. These next cases are pretty recent. I call this next one, We All Got Real Quiet. This occurred on February 22nd, 1997 in Aklavik, Canada, and a really interesting multiple witness case.
It was early in the morning hours of February 22nd, 1997 that Vera Ovayak, a resident of Tuktoyaktuk, was driving along the ice road near the small village of Aklavik when she was followed, she says, by two UFOs. And it's not just her, because with her in the car were her son Grant and three friends, Lena Kodokak and Churchill and Dorothy Wolke. But as Vera says, regarding this object, it hovered over the trees, then glided so smoothly down to the snow near the ice road behind us. When it started moving to the right, another one showed up. So she described these objects as silver gray. They had a row of portholes around them. And as Vera says, the one in front had four big windows, and the light coming out of them was bright blue. You could see the one in front real good. I think we panicked, and we were kind of scared. We weren't about to stop. So this craft actually followed them for about 15 minutes, but it disappeared when the road took a turn. As Vera says, we expected them to be there, but they were gone. Then we all got real quiet for about 20 minutes. I wasn't a believer of such things, but now that I've seen them, I'd never underestimate people's words. So Vera can sketch them as you see, but as she says, I'll never travel again without my camera. Next time, I'm going to take a picture.
Very interesting. That's not the first time, and I suspect it won't be the last, that a witness says that from now on they're going to carry a camera with them wherever they go. Because you never know when the opportunity is going to arise to take a picture of a UFO. It's one of the reasons we don't have more photographic evidence, because when someone sees a UFO, it's quite shocking, it's often brief, they don't want to take their eyes off of it. Nevertheless, the photographic evidence of UFOs is very, very extensive. People who say there are no photographs and they're all blurry simply have not done their research. There's an enormous amount of photographic evidence. And as you can see in some of these cases, people do take photos, but we don't get to see them. It's maddening. Now let's move to the last case in this compilation, which I call We're Used to It. This occurred over a period of weeks, actually, from December 2002 to January 2003 in Norvik, Alaska. I like this case because activity was so common. It was going on for so long that, as the witnesses say, they became used to it. This became not paranormal or abnormal or unusual. It became part of their daily routine, seeing UFOs in this area. Within the last 2 weeks of December 2002, that residents in the town of Norvik, Alaska, this is a small town of about 600 to 700 residents just above the Arctic Circle, had a series of dramatic UFO sightings. Said one of the residents, Teresa Pungalek, she's a bookkeeper and a rescue coordinator, she says everybody in town saw them. It would always be different every time. The one time I saw them, really bright, it was like a tower, like a pole with three lights on top of each other in a straight row, and there was another light strobing, going from place to place around the three. There was another light on the left side, like a glow. Every night it would be different. We've seen them maybe every night since it started.
So yeah, these sightings continued night after night. On one occasion, Teresa received a call from a resident reporting these lights, so she decided to call the FAA, who confirmed that they had no known aircraft in the area, but did advise her to send out people to investigate. So it was around 4 a.m. that she had 4 snowmobilers go out to check out these lights, which appeared to be hovering over nearby Sivu. This is about 20 miles away. But when they arrived, these lights just moved off ahead of them, and every attempt to reach them failed because these lights would always just move off. And the sightings just continued. As Teresa says, a lot of people were up that night watching the lights. They saw the first snow machines coming back to town towards them, when all of a sudden there were more than 4 lights coming. The 4 guys on the snow machine said that the lights were following them back to town. So these sightings continued so often to the point that they almost became normal. As Teresa says, we're sort of getting used to it, so we don't even check if they're still there. I understand that somebody has a videotape of it too. The local people are calling it a UFO. We don't know what else to call it.
There you go. More evidence that UFOs are visiting the Arctic Circle. So that's 24, 25 cases which have taken place near or around the North Pole. So amazing. And yeah, I didn't include all the cases that are kind of unverified or very conspiratorial of so-called underground government bases and some wild stuff people are talking about in the Arctic. It kind of blew my mind how much disinformation is surrounding this area. I think a lot of this stuff is just not true. So it was definitely a very difficult research project to sort out some of the really well-verified cases from cases that are just wildly speculative. I will say I did investigate my own case, which was secondhand, so I wasn't able to talk to the witness directly, but did so through an intermediary who said that he worked at an underground base in Alaska, which was several stories down. I don't know that this is within the Arctic Circle, but certainly close to it. It's interesting though, because according to this witness, he was lying to everybody, his whole family, about where he worked, which he said was in Las Vegas. But actually, he would be flown up to Alaska every week and come back on weekends. And he said he worked in an underground base in Alaska where they had 3 areas of research. One was sensing devices that basically could look through solid walls and roofs and solid objects. Another was biological warfare, which he said made weapons that we have look like child's play. But the third and most interesting to me, and important here I think, is that they were working on reverse engineering of ET technology. So again, this is unverified, secondhand, but one of many reports of whistleblowers saying that, yeah, this is a subject we take very seriously. So with 25 reports, again, just the tip of the iceberg. You could easily times it by 10 or 100 or probably even 1,000 if you think about it, because it's been a long time that UFOs have been visiting the Arctic. And with so many of these witnesses being military, I think that there's a lot more that we just don't hear about because of this really brutal cover-up that is being perpetrated on all humanity. It's such a shame. It can't go on. It's unsustainable. This is what I like about the truth. You can hide it. You can ignore it. You can distort it. You can lie about it. But you can never, ever destroy it. Truth is truth. And one day or another, it's going to come out. And I'm glad to see that we are able to see at least the reports we've got here, which are very well verified, despite all the weird conspiracies and wild speculations going on in the Arctic. We know for sure that stuff is going on up there in terms of extraterrestrial visitations. So that's it for today. UFOs in the Arctic, they're up there. I really want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly did. I certainly learned a few new things about the Arctic that I wasn't aware of. And one is, yeah, it's being visited by UFOs and extraterrestrials. So thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. Until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun. I will see you next episode. Bye for now.